Welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this event. Despite the Zoom fatigue and very busy schedule, your presence is much appreciated. My name is Alex Moshkin. I'm a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan, which focused this year on the theme of translating Jewish cultures. As part of the Institute, Adriana Jacobs and I have curated a poetry translation series that has occasioned this event. The series, Stranger Still, translating contemporary poetry from Israel, Palestine, showcases the diversity of poetic voices from Israel, Palestine through the lens of translation. Each event features a multilingual poetry reading and a conversation between poets and translators on the careful negotiation that are involved in the act of translating, highlighting works that creates its own currents against and beyond the Israeli mainstream. Today's event will feature a conversation between poets, translators, Sabine Nguyen and Karen Alkalay-Gut, who will be introduced in a moment, and the conversation will be moderated by Adriana Jacobs, who is an associate professor of modern Hebrew literature at Oxford. If you'd like to submit a question, please write them down in the Q&A down section of the screen. You can also turn on or off captions. That's it. Adriana, please take it away.
I have to remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Alex, for those words of welcome. I'm going to first introduce Karen Alkalay-Gut. She'll read then a few poems, and then I'll introduce Sabine Nguyen, and she'll read a few of her poems, and then we will convene together to discuss their joint translation project. So first, I'll start with Karen. When I first went to Israel in 1998, shortly after graduating from college, I had only the most basic Hebrew under my belt. I was determined to immerse myself in the Hebrew language, but there were days when I just needed to give my brain a rest and read works in English. And this is how I became acquainted with the work of English language poets living in Israel, poets like Shirley Kaufman, Robert Friend, Harold Schimmel, Dennis Silk, Linda Sisquit, and of course, Karen Alkalay-Gut. Karen was born in London in 1945 to parents who were Holocaust survivors. The family then relocated to Rochester, New York, where she grew up speaking Yiddish at home and completed a doctorate in English literature at the University of Rochester. She moved to Israel in 1972 and raised her family there while teaching poetry at Tel Aviv University, and she wrote poetry in English, some of it translated into Hebrew. She was the founding chair of the Israel Association of Writers of English, which was established in 1980 to support and promote English language writers, and in its words, to act as a bridge between Israeli society and the cultures of other English-speaking countries. In her 1993 essay, Notes on Writing in English in Tel Aviv, Karen acknowledges how her decision to write in English could be construed as a rejection of Israel's national language and culture. But at the same time, English language writers like her sensed an opportunity to serve as vital cultural ambassadors without the barrier of translation, as she put it. For a time, writing in English afforded her the privacy to develop her poetry on her own terms, creating her own intertextual weave without the pressure to conform to any poetic models or trends in English or in Hebrew. And it's not possible to do justice in a short introduction to the extent of Karen's poetic oeuvre, which now spans over 30 collections of poetry in English, Hebrew, and more recently in Yiddish. Cross-cultural movements are the connective tissue of her poems. They move readers between the US, Europe, and Israel, between US English and Israeli English, between home and street, between wars and everyday battles women wage for their own space and voice. And this latter issue has been a particularly resonant one in this year of pandemic. In a 2005 review of her work, Alicia Ostraker described her poetry as, and I quote, a vessel that can accommodate the sacred, the profane, the body and comic, the sensuous and tragic, the bedroom, the clothes closet, political statements along with personal fear, mourning, and tenderness. But how can a poem hold all this together? By way of an answer, I'm drawn to the opening lines of her poem, Wisdom of the World, from Karen's 1994 collection, Harmonies and Disharmonies, where she opens with these lines. There is a need for wider wisdom. I feel it every time I try to write. The fact that poetry is important must change lives. And now I welcome Karen to share with us some of her work. And I'm actually going to share the screen so that those of you at home can view this. So just bear 1 minute. This is always the more treacherous part of these events. So hopefully, yes, you can see the first poem on the screen. And Karen, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm trying out new poems and old poems. I hope you'll like this one, which is new. Gestalt. My husband's mother, a child psychologist, once gave me the perfect recipe for raising 3 healthy children. You make 4 and then throw away the first one. She was kidding, of course. She had learned Adlerian theories and finished her doctoral thesis with Kurt Lewin in Berlin when the Nazis were taking over. The subject was Gestalt theory, and she used Hebrew flashcards to test how German children learn. But she knew the value of irony and the terrifying danger of taking any system to heart. One of those nights. On the anniversary of my mother's death, a strange ghost appeared by my bed, wrapped in turban and shimmering cloth. It was very eerie, the dim light, the slow movement, the slim, erect figure. And then she began to speak Yiddish with a twang and an intonation I had not heard in years. You don't know me, but I'm a friend of your mother's from over there. And she talks all the time about your life and how you're turning out and how you don't appreciate her. And I want you to know you're missing some valuable facts in the way you've got her figured. Are you one of my aunts who died before I was born, I ask, as if this pre-dawn visit to my bed was almost expected and made perfect sense even in the real world. Was kriegst du nicht wichtig? Why should you always look for the irrelevant? You told me you always want documentation. She told me that. But I want you to know, and I think it's the most important item I can bring from the beyond, is that your mother actually loved you. It's very kind of you to come all this way, I say, but why do you need to tell me? Why in this way? And why now, after all these years, all my struggles to accept her inability to accept me? I'll tell you, I don't like to interfere, and I wouldn't be here now if I didn't think it was vital for the rest of your life. But you've got to admit, I look good in this light. The truth is, dear, that Naches takes on a different dimension over there. That your mother takes daily pleasure in your enjoyment of life. Even it is a life she would never have understood when she was burdened with her own world, her life. The truth is, dear, I respond, that this is a fantasy I've contrived to make the rest of my life easier. Fantasy schmantasy, enjoy the liberty. Take it with the joy you feel when you unhook your bra after a long, hard day. I want you to know I'm not at all impressed by the way your generation always has to come to negative conclusions from all your analysis. So why did she come herself? She had to send a delegate. I realize I'm already talking in her intonation. I'll tell you, she was afraid. She was afraid too. She was always afraid of you. Maybe next time she'll come herself. You never really understood, did you, how much stronger than her she thought you were, and how you forced her to go to new places, and how she learned eventually, and she went. Even your refusal to hate outright, and to give up on possibilities of understanding. The fact is, you've won, she knows it, and she's proud. And she said to tell you she loves the way you read poetry out loud, even though you still stutter and you always make a couple mistakes. Now for some Yiddish. Oh, they're all three together. I'll read it in English first, because there's not much eroticism in Yiddish. You lie long and still. I sit in the middle of the bed, look up to your face, down to your feet. Like cotton wool, like snow you lie, and allow me to make of your quiet what I will. אתה שוכב ארוך ושקט, אני יושבת באמצע המיטה, מביטה למעלה לפניך, למטה לרגליך, כמו צמר גפן, כמו שלג אתה שוכב, ומתיר לי לעשות משתיקתך כרצוני. That was the Hebrew, and now the original in Yiddish. Du liegst lang und still. Ich sitze inmitten Bett, guck herab zu deinen Punim, herab zu deinen Füßen. Wie Watte, wie Schnee du liegst. Und hast mir tun mit dein Schweigen, was ich will.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Electrifying as always. I remember hearing you read at Princeton in 2002 and had the same effect of me, of feeling completely jolted by the way you read. I can also see you moving your hands. I remember you're a very physical performer, and I feel like Zoom is sort of containing you in a way that doesn't feel entirely natural. So thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn to Sabine's poetry, but let me get my, sorry, I'm having to close one screen in order to open up another. So, well, now it's my pleasure to introduce Sabine Nguyen. The truth is I can't recall exactly when I became aware of Sabine's work, but I do remember initially feeling a bit disoriented. Even in my own multilingual map of Israeli literature, I wasn't quite sure where to place her. Was she a poet who wrote in English or French or Hebrew? Did she live in Israel, France, or the United States, or Canada? The answer to all these questions is yes. Sabine was born in 1972 in Saigon, Vietnam, and immigrated with her family to France in 1976. In a profile that appeared in the Jerusalem Report, she recalls receiving a copy of the American Heritage English Dictionary as a child, which sparked a love for the language, which then grew into a desire to write poetry in English. Her studies and work in sociolinguistics took her to the United Kingdom, then the United States, Boston to be exact, and then Israel, and then Canada, and then back to Israel, to Tel Aviv, where she lives, in her words, among all sorts of books and teapots. I imagine that these books, some which we can view behind her, may include the works of the US poet Anne Sexton, whose work Sabine encountered in Boston and is now translating into French. There too are her own collections, among them, and forgive me, Sabine, for my very poor university French, Parler peau, speak skin, Les colibris à reculons, hummingbirds going backwards, Vie en film co infini, Six City, Infinite Body, which was actually translated into Hebrew by Hillel Halkin, And a number of her books have been published in collaboration with visual artists whose drawings and photographs form a dialogue with her poems. And this collaborative spirit extends to Sabine's translation projects as well, more recently with Karen Alkalay-Gut, as we will discuss shortly, and with the Israeli author and translator Hagai Linik, with whom she's founded Pecham, a Hebrew-French literary journal. Across Sabine's several collections of poetry and in her published novels and nonfiction, we can discern certain thematic threads: exile, translation, memory, and survival, as well as intimacy and solitude. In the jacket description of Les Colibris à Reculons, Sabine describes immigrants as polyglot pollinators. Always in a hurry, she writes, on the verge of breaking, their wings beat tirelessly in the world's vastness and with the effort of survival. Unremitting by necessity, they fly in all directions without respite for life's sake, even in the dark with broken wings. The Hebrew poet Leah Goldberg suggested that an immigrant is like a tzipur masa, a bird of travel, a metaphor that recalls Wynn's hummingbird, a bird that can move backwards, upside down, but also remain suspended in space, like Goldberg's bird, caught between the past and present. For Goldberg, poetry could be a third landscape where past and present could come together and mix and blur. For Wynn, retrospection carries the risk that one may never come back to the here and present. In a poem titled Farewell Childhood, her speaker concludes, "If I thought of it there where it all happened, I'd turn into that silent child again and never come back. But I'm here now. I have opened the windows to let the landscape in and the childhood out." And now I welcome Sabine to share with us some of her poems. Which again, let me activate screen share and put them up for you. 1 second. And let me get you to the right spot. Here we go. So Sabine will read the French. You've already gotten a taste of my French, so you don't want to hear more of it. And then I will follow. I'll read the English translations, which she prepared. They're her own translations of her poems, of her French poems.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adriana. I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to read 4 short poems from a work in progress dealing with the Vietnam War and the exodus of the Vietnamese refugees. So the first one goes like this. Je travaillais comme bénévole au camp de réfugiés de Singapour où les Norvégiens apprenaient aux Vietnamiens à tricoter des écharpes et des pulls. Cet hiver dans l'Iowa, il a fait -30 au ciel, s'est écrié Miley en vietnamien tout en levant les yeux. Ils ne parlaient pas notre langue et nous ne parlions pas la leur. Pour raconter leur tribulation, ils mimaient, forçaient, les grimaces pleuraient, riaient, nous aussi. Les réfugiés du 25 Hawkins Road n'avaient que leur chemise sur le dos. Nul n'abandonne sa maison et sa vie pour plonger dans l'enfer le cœur léger.
I worked as a volunteer at the refugee camp in Singapore, where the Norwegians taught the Vietnamese to knit scarves and sweaters. That winter in Iowa, it was 20 below. "Oh dear," cried Miley in Vietnamese, raising her eyes to the heavens. They didn't speak our language, and we didn't speak their language. To tell of their tribulations, they mimed, made faces, laughed and cried, and so did we. The refugees at 25 Hawkins Road had only their shirt on their back. Nobody abandons his home and his life to plunge into hell with a light heart.
Au Vietnam, mon père a travaillé pour la PA&E, Pacific Architects and Engineers, d'abord comme interprète. Au service du combattant était leur devise. Des soldats américains et agents de la CIA draguaient ma mère venue le chercher au bureau. Puis aux ressources humaines, chez Pan Am aussi, leur slogan était « Nous sommes la compagnie aérienne la plus expérimentée au monde, société au logo du même bleu d'azur céruléen, devoir, espoir, liberté, le bleu ou la mort, mer, aéroport, autant de voies du salut sans issue.
In Vietnam, my father worked for PA&E, Pacific Engineers and Architects, first as an interpreter. Serving the fighting man was their motto. American GIs and CIA agents were hitting on my mother when she came to pick him up at the office. Then in Human Resources and at Pan Am, the one that advertised under the slogan, "World's Most Experienced Airline," two company logos of the same cerulean blue, duty, hope, freedom, blue or death, sea or airport. So many dead ends to salvation.
De ma bouche à ton oreille, de mon corps à ton corps, de ma main à ta main, ces histoires de terre perdue, d'eau ruisselant sur leur front, d'embarcations de fortune, dérivant tels des souvenirs égarés ou sombrant, eau salée gonflant poumons et lèvres glissant vers le grand silence. Le bateau est d'abord parti sans eux, mais ils avaient tout vendu pour la traversée du désert d'eau où l'on a soif. Vietnam, Cuba, Syrie, Éthiopie, les réfugiés troquent dangers et langues contre d'autres presque au bout du monde. Yukali et sa fée sont aux aguets.
From my mouth to your ear, from my body to your body, from my hand to your hand, these stories of lost land, of water trickling down their faces, of makeshift boats drifting like lost memories, or sinking, salt water bloating lungs and lips, sliding towards the great silence. The boat first left without them, but they had sold everything to cross the water desert where they were thirsty. Vietnam, Cuba, Syria, Ethiopia. Refugees trade dangers and languages against others, almost at the end of the world. Yukali and its ferry are on the lookout.
Je ne suis plus dans ce pays, je ne suis plus nulle part en mer, je n'ai plus de quoi mer, terre, mer, je dérive. Mon corps qui tombe trouble la surface de l'eau calme, tant d'eau et rien à boire. En vietnamien, on dit eau pour dire terre natale. Nuc, sans terre, c'est ressac. Marées et destin, usure et détresse, soif sans fin du poisson hors de l'eau, car perdre son pays, c'est perdre l'eau. Trop d'eau, c'est plus d'eau, juste le sel des larmes de l'exode au fond d'un tonneau. Sec, les corps allongés montent et descendent, entourés d'eau non potable et de ciel, corps flottants tels des ancres décrochées.
I am no longer in this country. I am no longer anywhere at sea. I no longer have a kwemme, a motherland. I drift. My falling body clouds the still water surface. So much water, and yet nothing to drink. In Vietnamese, they say water to say native land, nuc. With no land, it's backwash, tides and fate, fatigue and distress, endless thirst for the fish out of water. Since to lose your country is to lose water. Too much water is water no more, just the salt of exodus tears at the bottom of a dry barrel. The lying bodies go up and down, surrounded by undrinkable water and sky, bodies floating like unhooked anchors. Thank you, Sabine. I'm also just now noticing as we read this out loud, how sometimes the Vietnamese and the French almost seem to rhyme each other. The kwemme, terre-mer, that was really lovely. And not an easy thing, I imagine, to pull off. So let me just take off. So now we're going to shift to the third act, which is basically, so Karen, one reason I brought Karen and Sabine together is that they've worked on a translation project, which is the translation of Karen's collection of poetry. It's a collection of Holocaust poems titled Surviving Her Story, which Sabine translated into French as Survivre à son histoire, And it was published actually during the pandemic in June 2020 by the French press Édition de le-ehov. Sabine's holding it up. I'll try to put the link in the chat if I can. You can buy it through the publisher. If you're in Europe, I think Amazon Europe can also send it to you. I was able to get a digital copy pretty easily, so I'll make sure to put in the chat later on. So I'm going to ask Karen if she can just because I understand, Karen, that this collection did not exist ever. Usually when things are translated, it's a collection that's already appeared in the quote unquote original language, then gets translated. But in this case, Surviving Her Story was not a standalone collection until this book came out. So if you could just maybe tell us briefly how this project came to be, how you began working with each other.
Well, I published this book. This book exists because of Sabine. I grew up in an environment where one does not speak of the Holocaust, and I have only little bits and pieces of information. And I never really published much about the Holocaust until Charles Fishman asked me to contribute some poems to this subject. And then I gave them to Sabine one day, a few poems. She had been translating some of my poems, and beautifully. And I gave these to her, even though I probably had never read them out loud before. And she said, okay, I translated them, more, please. And they came, some of them had already been written, but never published. Some had not been written, because I really didn't like the idea of imposing the kind of pain that I felt onto other people. And so I kept asking Sabine, isn't this too much for you? Isn't this too painful? And she would say, no, come on, it's all right. And there were poems that exist only because of Sabine. And then it came out in French. And when I saw it in French and English, I thought it only has the French title. And that's good too, because I'm really hiding. Now that Sabine has outed me on this subject, I think I've been writing much more about this subject, about my personal recollections of other people and the stories they told me. I haven't written about my father's family, who had many stories to tell, and I have much more to say. And I think either it's got to come out again with Sabine, or I've got to get it out myself. You've given me the power, Sabine, and I want to thank you incredibly for this.
You're welcome. Most welcome.
So maybe we start with a poem from the collection that we could read the poem, The Market. Let me put it up on the screen. And then we'll read the English first, if you can, Karen, and then ask Sabine to read her translation. So let me pull it up. Actually, so here's the cover of the book, so you can see it. This is a personal family photograph, is what I understand. Karen, you've included photographs from your own family album in the book.
It's
and
all the
it's referenced.
I have.
And it's referenced in a number of the poems as well. So The Market. Okay.
The photograph, the only photograph I think I have is that picture. So it's not even from from a collection.
Sorry.
It's all there is. And
Yeah.
that's why it was so wonderful for me to see it as a cover. The Market. I used to go with my mother to pick chickens for slaughter. I don't know how she chose them or brought them to the shoichet, but there they'd be when we got to the shed by the cages, hanging from pegs on the ceiling and waiting to bleed dry. I'd always focus on the plucker's quick fingers, feathers flying like weightless snow, and his fiery touch burning the bumpy top skin, that with no effort suddenly resembled my own. Then at home, they'd be dissembled, the organs, unborn eggs, all pieces examined, little spleen, fingers of fat, dear yellow feet laid out on the koshering board, aslant against the wall of the sink. Friday evening, we'd meet again in each of the courses. Broiled liver ground together with rendered fat, blurred as separate beings and members, helping me to forget yesterday's origins. Next, the soup, the essence of sacrifice refined, with orbs of yolk and a promise to come. But it was the wings that made it all special for me. Put in my plate with the survivor's reminder to fly from the market to the depth of my poems.
Le marché. J'avais coutume d'aller avec ma mère choisir les poulets à égorger. J'ignore pourquoi certains plutôt que d'autres, ou comment elle les apportait au Shoichet. Mais quand on entrait dans le cabanon, ils étaient déjà près des cages, suspendus à des crochets au plafond, attendant d'être saignés à blanc. Mes yeux suivaient les doigts rapides du plumeur, les plumes virevoltant aussi légères que des flocons de neige, et sa torche enflammée brûlant la peau bosselée de couleur taupe, qui, en un rien de temps, ressemblait soudain à la mienne. Puis à la maison, on les disloquait. Les organes, les œufs non éclos, tous les morceaux étaient scrutés, petites rattes, doigts de gras, précieux pieds jaunes, déposés sur la planche à cachériser, posés en biais contre la paroi de l'évier. On se revoyait le vendredi soir, dans chaque plat, foie haché grillé dans de la graisse fondue, aussi trouble que des êtres et des membres disparates, m'aidant à oublier les origines passées. Puis venait la soupe, l'essence du sacrifice raffiné, grâce à des jaunes d'œufs dans une promesse à venir. Mais c'étaient les ailes qui me fascinaient, déposées dans mon assiette avec le rappel du rescapé de s'envoler du marché jusqu'à la profondeur de mes poèmes.
Thank you for reading those. So that's the market in English and French. I want to start with a question for you, Karen. So in writing about the Holocaust, these poems draw from your family history and from the remnants of your family album, but at no point in the collection do you propose that these poems are restorative, that they can recover this history and these lives. For example, in the long poem, Her Story, you write, but there is no real story. All that remains is a faded snapshot, a few sentences in unread memorial tomes, and for me, who cannot tell any story for sure. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the relationship between poetry and history as a way of telling or retelling history. What can a poem do? What can it offer to the historical record of the Holocaust or of any historical cataclysm?
Great question. In my case, in my personal case, it's the absence of history I'm most concerned with, that there's only a few hints, there's only a few facts I can base on. There's only bits of stories. So sometimes I have all these bits, then that's all I have. And it's one, I can record one detail and the emotion and the reaction, and that's the poem. The poem is the reflection of the absence of narrative, the absence of history. The Holocaust is such an enormous piece of history anyway that we can only recover a bit at a time. We may see a whole pile of eyeglasses and it moves us because we say, oh, how many? But we can never see what each person saw out of each pair. The poem takes one pair of glasses and looks at how, you know, each detail a person saw. I don't know if that answers your question in general, but it seems to answer mine.
Oh, absolutely. I love this idea of poetry acknowledging the absences and not necessarily trying to fill it in, but maybe even open it up even more so. So for Sabine, the question I have is, again, staying with this relation between poetry and history, is that I feel like in French, it's further enmeshed in the translation, because histoire in French is both story and also history. And did this complicate things for you in any way as a translator, or rather did this kind of slippage allow for other ways of expanding your and our understanding of history and poetry as history?
Well, I don't know if Karen remembers how we came up with the title for her book. Do you, Karen? Do you remember? You had first sent me a manuscript bearing the title Surviving.
Yes.
And when I asked you if that would be the final title, you answered that you actually wouldn't mind calling the book Her Story, in fact. So, but since you couldn't make up your mind between the two, I eventually said, let's combine both then and call the book Surviving Her Story.
Right.
That was because I wanted the word histoire, history, in the French title. I was convinced that the title had to bear that word with its expanded meaning. So as you said, Adriana, in French, the concepts of story and history actually merged into the same word, into the word histoire. And a poet shares private stories. She actually encourages this fusion by deciding which narratives are worthy or deemed worthy of memory and therefore of making history. And these are, in Karen's book, these are the stories of common people, those of refugees, her parents, her grandparents, her aunts and uncles, voices of forgotten and conspicuous people that are shared in poems. So Karen's book, Surviving Her Story, emphasizes that the remarkable people are not the sole actors of history, and that poetry can change the way we see things. So if we go back, for example, to the lines that you quoted, Adriana, from the poem Her Story, Karen wrote, "But there is no real story," which in French translate into "Mais il n'y a pas d'histoire qui soit vraie," and which, if you translate that back into English from the French, can also mean, but there's no such thing as true history, or there's no such thing as truth in history. So you can see how the French complexity actually deepens the signification. And there's also the poem Retelling the Tales. In French, you get raconter à nouveau les histoires, the histories, right? Which implies that there isn't but one history and that history is plural. And finally, in that same poem, Retelling the Tales, there are two wonderful lines, two of my favorite, featuring the words story, history, histoire. The lines are, "I always associate the story with her worn pattern linoleum floor," which I translated as "J'associe toujours l'histoire à son linoléum au motif usé." So here the French translation connects two worlds: the world of history with a capital H that is concerned with the stories of the big events and of the great people, and the world of the common people who live in modest homes with cheap linoleum covering their floors. So, of course, it emphasizes the strong connection between story and history, and the fact that the knowledge and narrative of past events cannot do without the narrative of common human stories.
So that brings me to a bit of a question for the translator. We see not only in a number of Karen's poems, she mixes Yiddish, Hebrew. You can also hear the cadences of these languages in her English. So I was also curious how, because you just addressed the kind of the multi-layered ways that that histoire can be back translated into English, and exposes all the ways that Karen is using this term in a very sort of rich way. But how did you approach translating these texts? Also, given that your own poetry has these multilingual cadences as well, but especially in translating sort of terms like shoichet or kashering, I was sort of curious how transparent these sort of terms would be for a French language audience, especially given that the book came out in France. And did that play a part in also kind of how you approach translating the work into French?
Mm-hmm. I think that the general rule I follow is that unless the heterolingual terms, the foreign terms, are used by the author in unusual or innovative ways, I don't translate them. I just make sure there's enough context for them to be understood. So I did not translate the Yiddish word shoichet, for instance, because the context was clear enough. But I did translate the word cashering, the cashering board in the poem The Market, into French with the term la planche à cachériser, because that is the term commonly used by the French Jews. In the poem Mathematics, Karen used the word cheder in the lines, and survivors we count the way we counted in cheder. So I kept the word cheder, because in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and in English, it is the word used to call an elementary Jewish school. If I had translated, there was no point in translating it, because translating it would have actually removed the Jewish flavor of the poem, which we did not want at all.
Thank you. I love getting the behind the scenes glimpse of what goes on in the translation process, but also it's clear that you and Karen really had a very rich dialogue with each other throughout the development of the book. I wanted to actually ask you both, let's jump around and read Exile, because I can see that we have 15 minutes left and we do have a couple of questions that I want to make sure we have time to get to. So I'm going to share the screen and bring up that poem. There we go. Karen, if you can start.
Exile. My mother strode forward with her jaw uplifted. She made sure we found a good place in every new world. My father lagged behind with steps longing only to return, but there was never a place to go back. Home for her no longer existed the minute you needed to leave. You could grieve all you like, but you had to keep breathing. Their pasts were reserved only for their dreams. They didn't even dare tell. Who knows what would occur if they tried to bind old faiths with new lives? A child of refugees, I seek their secrets, their sweet memories, the suffering they hid, willingly and unwillingly, the part of them that would make me whole. I have to say that there are lines here that are from the prayers, from Yom Kippur, willingly and unwillingly. There's all kinds of references that kind of echo into some kind of a question for redemption, for retribution? No, for pardon. Sorry. Sabine.
Exil. Le menton levé, ma mère avançait d'un pas décidé. Elle s'assurait que nous trouvions notre place dans chaque monde nouveau. Mon père traînait des pieds qui languissaient après le retour. Mais il n'y avait jamais nulle part où revenir. La maison n'existait plus à partir du moment où vous deviez partir. Vous pouviez pleurer tout votre soûl, mais vous deviez continuer à respirer. Leur passé était confiné dans leurs rêves. Ils n'osaient même pas raconter. Qui savait ce qui pouvait arriver s'ils essayaient de lier de vieilles croyances à de nouvelles vies? Enfants de réfugiés, je cherche leurs secrets, leurs doux souvenirs, le chagrin qu'ils taisaient, exprès et involontairement, cette partie d'eux qui me compléterait.
I have to say, one thing I'm really struck by is how both of you read your poems. And just Karen, how you really take your time, and you sometimes also you change little things. They're little tweaks. It's not the same poem that you're reading as the one on the page. And so then it's like we're drawn to different things as we're listening to you. But Sabine, you sometimes read slowly, sometimes you read at a faster clip, and it's just so fascinating to hear when you make the choice to go in one tempo or the other. I know this sort of stuff is one of the reasons I love live poetry readings. You get to experience the poem in this other version when you hear a poet read it. So thank you. Sabine, I'm gonna throw the next question to you in relation to this poem, Exile, because I know that you generally refrain from addressing explicitly your own family history, even though it's kind of threaded throughout the poems that you shared with us. And I understand this because especially the ways that doing so could risk pigeonholing you as a representative of this history. But I was struck by how so much of this volume touches on themes that we see in the more personal poems that you shared with us, refugees, linguistic displacement, intergenerational trauma. And I was wondering how much you tapped into this in translating Karen's poems.
Since I started translating books by Israeli writer and Holocaust survivor Uri Orlev about 15 years ago, I realized that Holocaust literature spoke to me in ways that others didn't, and that there were certain aspects and topics pertaining to Holocaust literature that I strongly related to, which meant that I was able to translate things written about those topics in a strong way with my heart and body and not only with my brain. So there's a reason why the poems I choose to translate and the books I choose to review also are mostly sad. I guess I'm good at that, because of what I went through in my own life, mainly my childhood and adolescence. I experienced a war as a child, followed by exodus, life as an exile, the hardship of growing up in France within a family plagued by extreme poverty and domestic violence. And all of these extreme things I experienced helped me to relate better, I think, and therefore to translate traumatic experiences in a way that is quite readable. So after all, translating is about finding the right words, just like writing is, and such words, the ones that would punch the reader in the stomach, don't come from dictionaries. They come from within yourself and your life experiences. So I think the poems you choose to translate do tell a lot about you, and that unconsciously you are always trying to say something about yourself through the books that you translate, and that's only natural.
Thank you. And related to that, Karen, and then we have a couple of questions that have come in. We've also received a lot of praise for the two of you and your selections of poems and how you've read them. So just so you know, the participants are grateful for what you've shared with us. But Karen, I think going back to how we opened it up, sort of how the book came together in light of this particular poem, Exile, and then the comments you were making about how it's threaded through with the language of Jewish liturgy, Jewish mourning. Why this book now? Why this kind of collection at this point in your literary career, at this point in your life?
Well, this has always been a part of my life. I grew up with refugees. My parents, as soon as they found a place to live, they took in refugees, families that I knew well, and I never knew their last name, and that's lived with us for months. Some of which I never heard. I never heard their stories. Sometimes I did hear. Uh, it's always been a part of my life, but it was a part that I didn't think people wanted to hear about. And I also questioned the poetic approach. How do you write poetry about Holocaust? And I thought one of the things is that, that you have to remove the imagery, because this is not a little, a romantic sonnet. It's something very concrete and something very, uh, uh, something that you have to handle and with great care. I make statements in these poems that are just blatant and painful. But I also, I also have good stories and happier stories to tell, not just sad ones. But this has always been a part of my life. My mother always looked for relatives, the possibility of relatives. My father had some relatives who remained, but my mother had no one, and with 6 sisters and 2 brothers, with families, there were a lot of people to look for. But I didn't even know the names of, I don't know, my aunt's married names, so I couldn't even look for their children. Now with internet and DNA testing and all those things, suddenly there's this possibility that maybe I have a cousin who was, who survived, first cousins, not just, ancestry, like these wider families, but real relatives that are very close to me. And some of them may be living, near me, but we don't even know that we exist. And I think that the internet has been a factor in my decisions to keep writing about this, because Sabine was also a factor. Phyllis Lassner is also a factor who keeps making me write research about the Holocaust. But it's other people who are forcing it on me, who are enabling me, and that makes it much easier.
So we have a question from Joseph Rosenstein for you, Karen. Was mother aware that she was reenacting her mother's trip to the market and her actions in the kitchen? And did she somehow, perhaps without words, convey that to you?
With words. She always told me exactly what her mother did and how she did it. My mother that they had chickens of their own. They didn't go to the market. That they had chickens in their yard. That my grandmother would know which army had conquered the city by the town by the language in which they approached her with a chicken in their hand and say, when they would say to her, cook it. If they said it in Russian, she knew the Russians had won. If they said it in Polish, she knew the Poles had won, or the Germans. It was always, it was always a part of their lives, the cooking. And my mother would always tell me the stories. When she cooked something, she told me exactly what her mother said about how can you get married if you don't know how to spread out a table full of lokshen, of noodles? If you don't know how to cut noodles, there's no way you can ever find a partner. So I had to learn how to cut noodles from my mother.
And the poem passes on those instructions.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's fascinating. This is it's from Simon Lichtman, who asks Sabine, who is Yukali, from the poem that you read? I know the answer, but I thought you should give the answer to that question.
Yukali is it's actually a place. It's an island from Kurt Weill's song. So it's a song that I like very much because I was actually asked to sing it in a short movie many years ago. So that's how I know the song.
And I think if we poke around your website, Sabine, we can find the short film. It's called Yukali, and it's on YouTube, and I watched it yesterday, and it's incredibly moving. So we're getting close to the end of time. We've received so many wonderful comments from participants who have loved the poems. One participant wrote that they were like a punch in my solar plexus. And I have to agree wholeheartedly with that. I think the book, the 4 poems that you read, Sabine, have not been published yet. Is that correct?
It is. It's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, which I really hope you finish. They're just absolutely fantastic poems. It's a really wonderful, I think it's going to make a really fantastic collection. So that's the answer to that question. Sabine and Karen, I can't thank you enough for being a part of this event. It's been a dream of mine to bring you together. And so I feel incredibly fulfilled and grateful for you for taking the time to share your work with us, and hope we'll stay in touch. So that concludes this event, and I will make sure to pass on the comments you've left to Sabine and Karen. I'll make sure they get a chance to see them. So thank you to everyone who's attended today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Sabine.